Thank you for joining us and welcome back to our channel. We appreciate your time. For those of you who are able to create 5 or 10 minutes every day to watch our content. In this video, I really want to talk with you on how the African foreign policy has changed over the past 20 years and some activities that has influenced that change. As you may have noticed on this channel, we talk about geopolitics because that's what's important in our current era. Geopolitics affect the economy of every country, and African countries are no different. If African countries do not understand the impact of geopolitics on their social activities, their economy, their development, their investment, trade, interaction with the global world, then there is a problem. On this channel, as you may have seen on our videos, we focus on how Africa as a continent interact with the global community. The first reason that African countries have considered or have transformed in terms of their foreign policy is that the African foreign policy has matured. Most African countries gain independence were not actually prepared by their colonial master in a proper way, but those that have some infrastructure were being destroyed. So having gotten that independence, they were focusing on internal issues to transform their healthcare system, to improve on their economy, to interact. Remember, Africa was partitioned to an extent where it still affects them until today. If you look at the past 20 years, they are beginning to pick up themselves to figure out what is possible and how Africa can also interact with the global community. Africa was considered to be an raw material continent. Until now, we see what's happening in several African countries. The lack of technology development in a whole lot of other areas. So Africa's priority was not global or international. Africa was focusing on internal issues, and that gave the opportunity for foreign experts or their foreign partners to basically come into the continent and carry out certain activities which were beyond the African people's understanding. But that has beginning to change so rapidly. So in the past 20 years, there has been a transformation. A big change that has happened or influenced Africa's foreign policy is the involvement of China in Africa. If you look at how African countries dealt with their former colonial powers, countries, especially in Europe, that colonized African countries, you will notice that the partnership has been that of not equals. It's not been on a win-win situation. That has dramatically affected a lot of African countries. They have struggled to find their feet in the international monetary system, in interaction in terms of social issues, having access to capital. But with the involvement of China in Africa, just take a look. Africa, with regards to China's partnership, has been a win-win situation in a number of areas. I know what you were thinking, like China coming in to bring in debt and hook up African countries. Of course, that's true. Who has given African money for free? Nobody. If you look at the huge international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and other funding organizations, those countries, according to research based on statistics, it shows that those countries, Africa, owe even more from those international multilateral systems than what's owed from China. So that's important to note. So with the involvement of China, African countries begin to gain some confidence in their interaction with the global world. They began to realize that infrastructure is possible. Development is possible. The thing here that most investors fail to understand about Africa is that the African people, African farmers, the local communities would prefer to see a bridge that links the rural area to the urban area so they are able to transport their food. And that's the solution China is providing to them. If they can realize that this is possible, others compared to other countries that just give money as loans or foreign aid. Aid is not working. Aid is not working so far as we have seen. A number of researchers, economists, experts, Dambisa Moyo, the Zambian economists, they have conducted a number of detailed research regards to Africa's receiving aid from abroad. That is not working. So I think with the involvement of China, it has changed the balance. Russia has been another country that has also tried to balance the interaction with Europe and also the United States in the continent of Africa. Most African countries were vulnerable after independence. They were not properly trained. They were not ready to defend their countries in terms of military equipment and preparation for a whole lot of other areas which are relevant for a country to protect its borders. But again, with regards to the changes in the past couple of years, a number of African countries have decided to shift towards Russia to acquire military equipment to be able to defend their societies, defend their countries. Remember, a number of African countries struggle to be able to defend themselves, their borders, whether that is in land, water, or sea. And that also gave them a number of insecurity. And for that reason, the African people have decided that, okay, it's time for us to seek foreign assistance. But this is not going to be through aid, but it's going to be actually for the military equipment that we need to be able to engage whenever it's necessary, as we all have seen in a whole lot of other areas. There are challenges in the continental Africa, no doubt, but the African people have decided that they want to charter their own path. And by them interacting with China and then Russia, I think it's not a bad thing. Every country should be free. The United States involvement in Africa, which is another reason, it's also important. America has its own allies in Africa, like Ghana, Zambia, and a number of other countries. America also have countries that do not agree with the way the U.S. foreign policy is going. A country like South Africa has stood up to the United States of America from the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and also a whole lot of other areas, from trade issues about the chicken issues a couple of years ago. So South Africa is not afraid to tell the United States where it's gone wrong. And that hasn't sit really well in the international circles. So the United States of America has a number of issues in Africa. The involvement of China in Africa as trying to shape the Americans' foreign policy. Some people will say that the United States is in Africa for developmental issues. Of course, Africa needs development. Africa needs partners. But when you're involved in the continent of Africa, specifically because Russia and China are in Africa, that sends a red flag with regard to some African countries, the way they perceive it. African policymakers and experts, they are talking to their government. So the United States involvement in Africa has some positive impact in terms of the health issues, development, growth in a whole number of areas. But I think that African countries becoming more independent and being able to interact globally will work for the win-win aspect from the West and also African people in general. Otherwise, if the United States and Europe continue to engage in Africa as a means to repel Russia or China, that's going to cause a lot of antagonistic approach from the African perspective. So remember, most African leaders have talked about this paternalistic approach, especially from a country like France, the way they perceive this relationship. So African nations now selecting new partners is sending shockwaves across the global community, where they felt that Africa should stay in the same position that it's been over the past 50 years. The creation of the African Union is a very important thing that has also shaped Africa. Some will criticize the African Union for not being able to stand up to some very important continental issues. There is no doubt. But the existence of a body that is able to once in a while come up with some relevant position, talk about some other issues, whether it's the war in Ukraine or the United States invasion in Iraq, in Niger involvement in Afghanistan. African countries and African Union have their personal and individual positions that they've taken over the years, whether it is in the United Nations and African Union involvement in global issues. So we all have seen that the African Union transforming from the OAU previously, from the Organization of African Unity, and now to the African Union. They've had some leverage in a number of areas. Of course, some will say that the African Union is just a dog that barks but never bites. But again, they bring in some perspective and to give a better picture on where Africans stand in these global issues. So the organization is important. Of course, they will begin to continue to transform as we move over the decades. So that's important for Africa to have that organization going, and why they begin to work into the internal systems to improve it so they can take a more Africa-centric approach to face these global issues that are affecting not just the continent of Africa, but Africa in setting itself that it has matured over the years. A big game changer over the last 20 years has been the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. This is vital. For those of you who don't know, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is an important landmark arrangement for the continent of Africa to encourage African countries to trade among themselves. If you look at past 20 years, trade between Europe among its countries is really high. The United States the same, but Africa, some statistics shows just about 17%, others show 20%. So with the African Continental Free Trade, the AFCFTA, which is now at the moment in the implementation phase, will transform things, will give African countries an opportunity to start, one, to believe in themselves, secondly, to see what's possible. Others will criticize that it hasn't achieved a number of criteria that were set. Of course, you do not expect the AFCFTA to become more so effective as in the implementation phase. Well, what is possible with regards to this organization is that it has shown the African people that this is possible. We can trade among ourselves. We can have a common community. We can ship goods from Zambia to South Africa, from South Africa to Democratic Republic of the Congo, or from Nigeria to Kenya, to a whole lot of other sections within the continent of Africa. So by having this structure in place, it gives the African people a sense of belonging, a sense of understanding. And this hasn't gone well with regards to the global community, the International Trade Organization, the European Union, the United States. If you look at the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So this AFCFTA is causing a lot of friction internally. So all of this is geopolitics, because if African countries are able to trade among themselves effectively, it will slow down the number of export that they will send to other countries, to Europe in particular, to the United States, looking at the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and you have every other aspect in Europe, which is being called everything but arms, where the European Union interacts with African countries. Also, China would have some impact. It could be a slowdown in terms of trade with China as well, and other parts across the world, including the Middle East. So the African Continental Free Trade, it's something that has influenced African foreign policy. It has shaped the way Africans think about themselves, how Africans believe about trade, how Africans perceive business, how Africans see what is possible in the continent to leverage their potentials, to be able to make informed and strategic decisions for their own people, and also to have a common position in business. Another very important strategic changes in the African foreign policy is the influence of the African youth in the past 20 years. The African youth in a number of countries in the continent are beginning to make their voices heard. So the leaders in the continent are listening to the youth. Africa will become a strategic continent in the next 20 to 2050 based on statistics. Every other job or every other country, or 10 or 20 people working in any company around the world will be an African. And the emerging African middle class is going to be an influential contribution for Africa's transformation. This is going to happen. It's just a matter of time. So that bulging population, if you look at Europe facing a number of challenges in terms of the old age pensions, and also what's happened in France most recently, and who is going to fill that gap. So Africans have this huge workforce. The challenges there will be to fit them with jobs, and also to accommodate this population, to avoid them moving and transferring or traveling to other countries or other continents, as we've seen what happened in Sahara, to reduce this brain drain that Africa will face. So this is going to be, it's a win-win situation for Africa in terms of the emerging middle class and the youthful population. But again, it will bring a huge challenge to the African countries to be able to accommodate this growth. Look at the number of African students leaving universities to fill this middle gap. But are the jobs there? Are the people there? So Europe is observing this. How can Europe tap into that? How can American tap into that? Look at the green card, the impact it has had. Of course, there are positivity in between all of these aspects. But again, the growing middle class and the population has also influence on how the world sees Africa, and that enables African government to bring that bargain in terms of negotiations and trade. Last two important aspects where Africa has changed is that the African military has matured. Let's go back to the coup years in Africa, where Africa was cooled, the highest coup bird in the world in West Africa, especially in Francophone African countries, where you have coup after coup, in Ghana as well, and a number of countries. That has changed. If you look at what's happening in the Sahel at the moment, it's not what has been prevalent. Those leaders are beginning to speak out in several ways. Whether you like them or you don't like them, but it's different. There must be something happening in some African proverb, you will say that if you are able to see a rat running in the middle of the day under a hot sun, there must be something chasing them. So what's happening in Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger is not something that happened overnight. It's been building over the years. So the question many people should be asking is that if you consider the coups that happened several years ago, these were coups that came with huge bloodshed. However, in recent years, you realize that the coups that have happened, there has been less attack in a number of government institutions, less destructions in a number of areas. The African people are beginning to understand that their future is in their own hands. That Western countries in Europe or the United States or China, away from policy aspect, will not shape their society. So they're beginning to move and step into those gaps that we all have seen over the years. The final reason why the African policy has transformed and is sending shockwaves to the global community is that for the first time, the African people have started believing in themselves. They believe in Africa's potential. They believe in Africa, what Africa can accomplish as a continent, and what the African people themselves feel that there is a huge potential in the continent, and that what is needed is just some hard work. So if you look at the behavior from African countries at the moment, and more importantly, the African people are aware of what's going on in their regions, in their country. They can tune in with the development of the internet. They know what's happening in election in South Africa, what's happening in election in Zambia, what will happen in election in Gabon, and a whole lot of other areas. African countries or African citizens have become more curious in what's going on in their continent and how they interact with the global community. This is so vitally important for Africa's transformation, and for that awareness creation, it has impacted the way the world will see the continent of Africa. And the development of the internet, and also in terms of YouTube, has given African countries or African experts, individuals, to be able to tell their own story. And they begin to believe that it is still possible in the continent. The narrative of that Africa is where businesses go and die. It's a poor continent that's not holding ground anymore. So if you consider all of these changes, the past 20 years has been a transformative period in the continent of Africa. And we all will be looking at what the next decade brings, because 2050 is going to be when African countries will be able to sit on themselves and also take strategic decisions, whether in the United Nations, the financial institution, immigration, and also aviation. In a whole lot of other areas, the African continent has transformed. This shift has caused a lot of confusion in the global community. And if Africa is able to get its house together, it will be able to have a huge influence, not just from Ukraine, as Africa has learned its lesson in what happened between Russia and Ukraine in terms of the grains. African people have taught that this is our century. We have to take things in our own hands. We have to, don't forget, Africa has 28% of the voting rights to the United Nations. That is huge. Africa has begun to understand its influence in the world. So you can't just rubbish the African's perspective anymore, because they are able to influence decisions, not just in the United Nations, but in other sectors. The last 20 years have been a very important transformation in terms of Africa's foreign policy and Africa, how they interact with the global community. This hasn't gone well, and it's bringing a lot of confusion. And for those who were able to say they were in control, and they are losing control, and that's affecting the way they perceive the African continent as a whole. We want to thank you for watching. If you are new to our channel, we encourage you to check some of our informative video on this YouTube channel. We are looking forward to meeting you soon. Let us know what you think with regards to the last 20 years, what has transformed in terms of African perspective, and what do you think that Africa should bring in on the table? And also let us know how you feel the next 20 years will be for the people of the continent of Africa. We are looking forward to meeting you again. Have a good day. Bye-bye.